Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and today my guest is historian Ira Wesley Kittmacher. He's the author of Pacific Northwest Legends and Lore, but today what he's going to share with us is the Jews, Poles, and Germans' belief in monsters and miracles that set the stage for and featured in the Holocaust. So, Ira, take it away. Tell us first, kind of like an overview, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty.
Okay. And thank you, Phyllis, for having me on your program. So yes, this particular book that I wrote called Monsters and Miracles, Horror, Heroes, and the Holocaust came out in 2022 is very close to me, very important to me. In part, it was about my mother and my father. My father was a survivor of 5 concentration camps. My mother was in the U.S. Navy waves during World War II.
Wow.
And so in their own ways, they fought against the Nazis. But in the book, I tried to take a unique view of the Holocaust, which is I have a particular interest in folklore, stories passed down, especially things related to the supernatural and the paranormal. And it just so happens that the Germans heavily bought into ideas related to that. Jews, as you mentioned, have hundreds of years of beliefs related to the golem and the Ark of the Covenant.
Wait,
And
wait. You need to say the golem was in Prague.
correct.
Okay. I've actually seen where the golem is supposedly uh, somewhere there. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And the Poles had their own folkloric beliefs. So I wove this book together telling the history of the Holocaust, which many people know, but then tried to weave in these unique things that people don't necessarily know about, these folkloric beliefs in monsters and miracles and angels and things like that.
But one of the things that I thought was really interesting in this thing about Germans and werewolves is that American children read Brothers Grimm, but they read a very much sanitized, right?
Right,
The Brothers Grimm are very grim stories
right,
in German.
right. Very true. They wrote a series of stories and books back in the 1800s. Many of their stories were highly anti-Semitic, and but they also tied into folklore and some happy tales. And if we move forward to the 20th century, Walt Disney, made a series, a number of movies, and many of the Disneyland and Disney World rides are based on the Brothers Grimm. But as you say, they're sanitized versions. There's no longer this anti-Semitic, and in the original stories there were. And in the book, I talk about how one of the reasons why I believe that the Germans became the monsters that they were, the Nazis that they were in World War II, was because they were raised on a steady diet of stories from the Brothers Grimm with these anti-Semitic tropes and tales and stories. And so by the time the economy of the world went down in the 1920s and the Germans were suffering after World War I, it was easy for them to turn and blame the Jews. And again, they had all these stories from the Brothers Grimm and others saying how bad the Jews were.
Yes, for those, I'm working on a book right now, Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust, and I just recently learned very much more about the stab in the back, that literally the moment the Germans lost in World War I, they started blaming the Jews.
Right. The Jews and other Eastern Europeans,
Yes,
primarily the Jews,
and
were
communists.
subhuman, and the Germans called them vampires. They were draining the blood, the lifeblood of the fatherland, endangering the blood and soil. We've heard that term many times in the last few years. And yes, you're right. They blamed the Jews for stabbing them in the back, causing them to lose World War One. And yeah, it really fed into the Holocaust.
Okay, wait, I have to add an historical figure. Jews in Germany fought uh, very valiantly for Germany. Many of them won Iron Crosses, and there was even a census that tried to prove that they didn't serve in the proportion that they were in the population.
Right.
And when they discovered that that was actually not true, that census was never published, which I
Right.
found fascinating.
Right.
Okay, so now we have this stab in the back, and now we have this folklore that they're using. So let's talk more about the folklore.
Okay. So the stories that the Germans and really many countries around the world have told about the Jews go back thousands of years, really. The Jews have been blamed, as we know, for things like the bubonic plague and the economic downturns and blood libel, where Jews supposedly used the blood of Christians to make matzah, and all these outrageous stories. And these have been going on for really 1,000+ years. Ever since the break between Christianity and Judaism, Jews have been blamed for just a myriad of horrible things in the world, none of which are true. And so these stories have been going on, and then speed forward to the 1800s, and we get to the Brothers Grimm, which we already talked about, and they wrote their stories, which were anti-Semitic tropes.
Now, do
And
you think that they were very anti-Semitic themselves, or they didn't even realize that they were, you know what I'm trying to say? They just, it was in the zeitgeist.
I think that for Germans in the early to mid 1800s, they probably didn't recognize that they were being anti-Semitic. They were just, I think, saying what they thought was the truth. And it's difficult for us in 2025 to look back and say they were anti-Semitic back in the early to mid 1800s, although in retrospect, obviously they were. So it was taken as almost a normal discourse on the status of things to blame the Jews for all these horrible things. And we just went to Europe. We've been to Europe several times. I should mention that based on this book that we're talking about, I'm actually working with two different Jewish travel companies to do a tour of Poland based on the book. It's currently scheduled for September of this year. But I've been to Europe a number of times, and always focused on these anti-Semitic folkloric tales. Things like on churches in certain places in Germany, there are statues of the Jew pig.
Yes,
Uh,
I saw it in Regensburg, Germany, a couple of
that,
years ago.
we
Went
saw that too,
purposely to see it. I mean, to look at the one on the church.
right? So, and I mean that's a 700-800-year-old church. So these horrible stories have been going on for all this time, and then the Germans again believed that they are descended from noble werewolves or wolves, to the point that they actually named their submarine fleet a wolf pack, and individual submarines were named for individual wolves, that as well as the Brothers Grimm.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I mean, I did know the wolf pack, but I never thought about it in terms of what they thought of themselves.
right. It's interesting to me that they believed werewolves were somehow noble creatures protecting the blood and soil of the fatherland, whereas vampires were horrible, blood sucking creatures related to the Jews and other subhumans. And even before World War II and at the beginning of World War I, the Germans made several movies. One of them was Nosferatu, one of the original vampire movies, with Count Orlok. And Count Orlok, people since then have written how Count Orlok looks like what the Germans thought the Jews looked like, with long hooked noses and a balding high forehead. And so much has been written about how Nosferatu, and they also had made the movie The Golem, which of course we know, as you just mentioned, is a Jewish supernatural figure intended to protect the Jews of Prague and other places. But the Germans turned it into a bloodthirsty monster in this movie, The Golem.
Interesting.
So these all foretold of the Holocaust, even though they were at the beginning of World War I. So anti-Semitism has been continued on. It's just that the economic downturn and the loss of World War I really gave Hitler the ammunition he needed to really launch his final solution.
I wish I had had in front of me. I read it earlier this morning and wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal already, which I'm sure they probably won't publish, but
Mhm.
in which Jared Baker has a column today called something anti-Semitism is on the right, something. And his first paragraph is, there's one thing the left and the right can agree on: blame the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I find this so difficult to understand unless perhaps you can talk more about the pagan background, because Tacitus, I learned this from my daughter, I would not have known this otherwise, um, wrote whatever century he wrote about the warlike Germans in a treatise called the Germania. Probably
Right.
mispronounced that too.
Right.
And where does this bloodthirstiness come from?
Right. Actually, and I do write in the book about sort of the basis of the Germans' hate. And I think in part it's because they didn't have their own country until I think it was 1877.
Something like that.
They were just a fiefdom of principalities, and they also hired themselves out to fight for other countries. For example, in the American Revolutionary War, they fought as the Hessians
Oh, yes, I
and came
just,
over here and fought for the British. Now, 90% of those Germans, those Hessians, stayed in America after the Revolutionary War and settled here. But again, this bloodthirstiness. Washington Irving wrote the book The Headless Horseman, Sleepy Hollow, in 1820, based on this Hessian soldier who lost his head and became a bloodthirsty ghoul who killed Ichabod Crane by throwing his pumpkin. So Germans, as early as that in America, were seen as bloodthirsty. Speed forward to 1877. Again, the Germans finally unified around Bismarck and had their own country. And they were very warlike. They had been fighting for centuries for other countries. Now they had their own country. And so they were going to be very militaristic, which they were. They got into a number of wars before World War One. And then in World War One, they became the bloodthirsty Hun. The British and the Americans and others, they had wartime posters of Germans being gorilla-like, King Kong-like creatures, and they referred to them as the Huns, referring back to Attila the Hun, who was a bloodthirsty Mongolian warlord. So throughout history, the Germans have had this bloodthirsty, militaristic reputation. Now, what's interesting also is they're also, generally speaking, a very highly cultured, responsible for much of classical music, beautiful artwork. And so, to me, in the book, I talk about how when it came down to whether the Germans were going to pick the side of darkness, Hitler and the Nazis, or the more cultured background that they had, it was almost like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Which personality was going to come out? And unfortunately, to me, Hitler was able to um, gain the confidence of the German people and make them move towards the dark side, or at least for many of them ignore, or at least they said they didn't know what was going on. I don't think that's really true, but to ignore all these things that were happening in World War II.
to me, and I am not an historian, although my husband and I did live in, we were stationed in Munich, Germany with the US
Mhm.
Army from September 1970 to May 1972, which has led to what I'm doing now. I think there were two very different groups of Germans. I
Mhm.
think when we talk about the intellectuals, we're talking about a very small group that did a lot of important cultural things.
Right.
And then the peasants, now I don't mean that in derogatory, but I am meaning it in a description, who really were still, I don't want to say pagans,
Mhm.
in terms of their some of the things that they did in terms of religious hatred.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that folklore itself comes from the beliefs of really the poor and the non-educated. And although to me folklore is very important, it's studied in Harvard and other places, and it
Right.
goes hand in hand with history. But I think the basis, much of it comes from the poor and many people who made up tales to explain things that were not explainable. It's true all over the world. It's true in America. The Native Americans have countless folkloric tales to explain tsunamis and volcanoes, and so the Poles have countless folkloric tales to try to explain why it is that they were the crossroads of Europe. Every country, Napoleon, the Russians, others, all marched through Poland, and so Poles, again, this is generalizing, have a very negative um, feeling of being beaten upon, which is based on all these armies crossing through there. The Jews, as we know, for centuries have been made into the criminals and the bad guys and causing the Black Plague and the economic downturns. And so we as Jews, I think, have a heavy feeling of, I think, and again in the book, I talk about how to some extent many Jews maybe hide a little bit because they're afraid of or don't trust what's going on out there. My father did that after his experiences in the Holocaust. I think he had a hard time trusting people and tried to sort of lay low.
Wait, could you want to give us a brief where his Holocaust story briefly?
Sure. And I should say that I have my notes in front of me. Because I want to get
Okay.
the specific places that he was. So my father was born in Lublin, Poland in 1920. And he had two sisters, a
Wait,
brother, and
wait.
his.
I got to get my map.
Okay.
Okay. So I always have to see what part Lublin was in the. Can you hear me? Right.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. I'm looking up. So Lublin was in the. Okay, general government. Okay, I just have to explain because I'm trying every time when we talk about Poland to explain when the Nazis entered Poland, attacked Poland, September 1st, 1939. Poland was divided in three. Western part was literally annexed into the Third Reich. Lublin in this middle part was part of the general government, which was run by
Mhm.
the Nazis but wasn't Germany. And the East was invaded under the non-aggression pact of August 1939 with the Soviets, was invaded by the Soviets, occupied by the Soviets
Right.
until June 1941. Okay, so now he was born in Lublin. Okay.
And I'll take a step back and say, before I start on that, the Jews had lived side by side with the Poles for 800 years. And although they had relatively peaceful relations, of course, there were pogroms and other persecution that took place over the centuries. But the Jews were a long-time presence. My father's family, really, as far as we can go back, was family of tailors and seamstresses, not uncommon. And so my father was born in Lublin, Poland, 1920. Um, they were moved out as soon as the Nazis invaded, as you said, in 1939. I should say that before that, my father's father, my grandfather, a tailor, during the economic downturn of the 1920s, decided to move to Germany. So he actually went to Berlin and worked as a tailor in Berlin, which is a much bigger economy and a big city, and did fairly well until Hitler came in 1933 and they chased all the Jews out of Germany. So my grandfather then came back to Poland, back to Lublin, and immediately moved the family to Warsaw because that was a better economy than Lublin. It was not too long after that happened that the Nazis invaded. That was 1939, September 1st. Many of the Jews were moved into the Warsaw Ghetto. My father and his family moved into the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940.
Yes. And can I just say one thing that I always trying to say? In terms of always trying to warn people about not saying the dates are wrong. They were ordered into the ghetto in October of 1940, but the ghetto
Mhm.
wasn't sealed until November 1940. So if you ever see those two different dates, both are right.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
So this family was moved into this little, I'll call it an apartment, that's being generous, with three or four other families, with one toilet and no shower, just a little basin that they all had to wash out of. And so they were then in the Warsaw Ghetto for, I want to say it was close to a year before my father. And there's a series of stories. We probably don't have time for them.
Right.
I
So let's move. Yeah. Okay. So move
I do
forward.
detail them in the book, but my father was able to escape the Warsaw Ghetto with one of his sisters, and they lived on a farm for a short period of time. And then came a series of things where the Nazis basically took away his parents, took away his two sisters and his brother, and my father, then ended up in five concentration and slave labor camps. One was Majdanek outside of Lublin, which was where the Warsaw Ghetto survivors were sent. Budzin, which is not necessarily a well-known concentration camp, but it was actually one of the more violent
Wait.
ones.
Can I add one other thing? The
Sure.
original deportations of the Warsaw Ghetto, starting in summer 42, they went directly to Treblinka, where they were murdered outright. But
Mm-hmm.
eventually, what Ira is saying, that the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, when the Warsaw Ghetto was totally liquidated, went to Majdanek. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, go ahead.
So they went to Majdanek. Then he ended up in Budzin. Um, And then he ended up again, in the book, I describe a series of things that happened. I refer to them as miracles that allowed him to survive. I won't take our time up right now with them. He then ended up in the Wolitzka salt mine, which interestingly still exists in Poland and is actually a major tourist attraction, with all kinds of beautiful sculptures made out of salt. But many people don't know that Jews and others were sent down there to dig um, salt.
Could you spell that? That I don't recognize that name. Could you spell
Sure.
it?
Wielicza, Wolitzka
Okay.
salt mine outside of Krakow. The Germans had actually planned on building an underground arms factory in there in the mine, but they never did. Um, so, and
Okay.
today it's a tourist attraction. Leichmerz in Germany by the Czech Republic was a large subcamp of Flossenburg, another one of these large, lesser known concentration camps.
Flossenburg was in Germany, though, right?
Right.
So
Uh,
he was moved west. Okay. Is that
right. And in the book, I tell of how he was moved west. I'll tell a very quick story of this, which is when at that point, and it was heading towards 1943, 1944, the war was getting closer to the end. The Nazis moved some of these Jewish prisoners west into Germany by train. And my father tells a story of being on this two-level train, and he was on the bottom level. Most people wanted to be on the other upper level because it was open air, they could breathe better. Unfortunately, the British sent Spitfire planes in and they machine gunned this train. My father tells how he survived because he was on the bottom level, but all those above him were killed. And not to get too graphic, but as you can imagine, as people were being killed above you and blood is seeping down. So it's just one of these, for my father, a miracle that he survived, but another horrible event.
and this is something in terms of things you didn't know that I've never heard about this a double level train.
Right,
So that although it's pretty horrifying. I'm glad you shared with us because again, we're learning. And just to remind people, why were they moving the prisoners west? Because the Germans, oh, excuse me, the Soviets were coming from the east.
right.
So okay, so now what happens now that he's miraculously survived?
He also, while in Flossenburg, he ended up working at several um, airplane factories for the Germans. At some point, they did a separation of the Jews and said, "What did you do for a living?" And if he had said he had worked as a tailor, he would have been killed on the spot. But instead, my father, he was a very smart man, thought to say, "No, I'm a sheet and metal worker," which he never was. But of course, the Germans allowed him to live, and they had him work at Messerschmitt factories and Henkel airplane factories, and one of those was located by Flossenburg. 1944, late 1944, he and a number of Jewish prisoners are moved to Stamsried in Germany, which is in Bavaria. And he tells the story of how he and this only 50 Jews were left living after tens of thousands had been murdered. And they called the Burgermeister out into the town square, the mayor of Stamsried, and they had Ukrainian guards, which in part is why Putin is always saying how Ukraine is Nazi. There's a connection only because many of the Nazi guards were Ukrainian,
Yes.
but not to say that Ukraine today is obviously
Yes, right.
Nazi. But the mayor comes out. They say, "What are we going to do with these Jews?" And everybody's saying, "Shoot them, shoot them." And then, in a very dramatic movie-like story, everyone looks up into the hills, and over the hills comes Patton's army with American tanks with white stars on them. The Ukrainians and the Germans all ran into the woods, and my father and the others were saved. So another miracle.
What do you know what day this was?
I have late 1944. I think in the book I do have the specific date, and actually I researched when it was Patton's Army came into Stamsried, so I don't have it right in front of me.
Okay, well, we're going to share a link in the description. I'm going to share a link of where they can get your book so everyone can look it up. But that's really interesting.
Right.
It's
And
talk about the cavalry arriving in the nick of time.
right. So much of the, and I, when I started the book, I said that I was going to take a cinematic view of the Holocaust. Not to say it was a rosy, obviously not a rosy, whatever. And my publisher said, "What do you mean a cinematic view?" And I said, meaning that to me, it really is the story of the horror stories, the folklore that the Germans, Jews, and Poles all believed in and how that fed into the Holocaust. We haven't talked about the Americans yet who developed the superheroes, Captain America, Wonder
Yeah.
Woman, Superman. And so to me, it's a very cinematic um, event World War II and the Holocaust, including Patton's army coming over the hill and saving the so so anyway, so then my father was liberated. He met a number of American Jewish soldiers. They were given candy. He got very sick. He only weighed 85 pounds at the end of the war. He always weighed about 175 pounds later on. He got very sick because he ate candy and someone killed a pig on a farm. It was the first meat he had had in years. He survived again. He was then moved into the Munich displaced persons camp, Munich, Germany, which he was there from 1945 to 1949 before immigrating to the United States.
I am in preparation for Pesach at the moment, reading a book that was just republished called A Survivor's Haggadah that was actually used by, not in the DP camps itself, but the DPs who had moved out of the camp for Pesach of 1946. But
Right,
it's a very interesting account of combining the Pesach story
right,
with the liberation story
right.
of the Nazis. Now, wait, there was something that you said that I wanted to. Did your father come from a religious family?
No, they were not a traditionally religious family. He talked about how, and I, in addition to obviously knowing my father very well and
I would hope so.
talking occasionally, he also was interviewed in what became the Steven Spielberg recording of the
Right.
survivors. So his interview is available online at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I wanted to say that. But no, he did not come from a traditionally religious family. They did go to synagogue on the high holidays, uh, but but otherwise, no.
But he did talk about the Holocaust when you were growing up. Is that right or not?
A little bit. He didn't really. It wasn't until 1994 that he was interviewed as part of the Steven Spielberg project that he really came forth and told all the stories. We had gone back to Germany back in 1991, and he talked a little bit about the camps he was in and his experiences. He refused to go back to Poland, although he was willing to go to Germany, because he blamed the Poles more than the Germans, because the Poles were the ones who were the supposed friends, neighbors of these Jews, but turned on them. And I talk in the book about how, in some ways, these Polish villagers were like the pitchfork carrying villagers in movies like Dracula and Frankenstein and turning on the Jews. So he had more negative views towards the Poles versus the Jews.
That brings me back to a very, very old anecdote that when my husband and I were in Munich, there was a sergeant who was a survivor. At the time, I really knew so little, but I'll never forget he said, when the cars were bringing them west, clearly at the time, I didn't realize near the end of the war, that
Mhm.
the only time the doors were opened was when they got to Germany. The doors were open for air. In Poland, they were not opened. And I've never forgotten that. But now, when you talk about it, I'm finally putting these little pieces of memory together.
Right. Yeah. No, these are fascinating stories to me that come from this period of time, a horrible period of time that hopefully we'll
Yes.
never see again. But can I take a minute just to go through quickly some of these folkloric
Oh,
themes that I?
absolutely. And also, I wanted you to just, if we have a few more minutes, 10. I would
Yeah,
like you to mention quickly the superheroes of the Americans and how Jewish. Yes, haven't talked about that yet in any of my podcasts.
right. So in the book, I talk about these various folkloric tales. I talk about things like salt. Um, the Jews were not alone. If you watch any modern day television programs about horror movies or paranormal things, salt plays a very big role. Salt supposedly wards off ghosts and evil spirits. Well, it was common amongst the Jews of the late 1800s, early 1900s to throw salt in the corners of their rooms in their house to ward off evil. So, salt. Um,
Wait a
uh,
second. And is that the basis of the custom today that you bring bread and salt to someone's new? Um,
Yes, that's my understanding is that salt has some kind of supernatural qualities to it that wards off evil.
but I never thought. I just thought it was, oh, bread and salt you bring to someone's home when they just moved in. That's
Right.
fascinating.
Similar to metal, um, late 1800s, early 1900s, Jews and others would attach metal pins and other things to their garments when they went about because metal was thought to ward off evil, especially iron was thought to ward off evil. So my actually in the book I talk about how my father says his mother used to sew a needle into some of the children's fabric so to ward off evil. So again, this old story. We talked about the superheroes. I'll just mention them right now. Superhero Captain America. Um, in the 1930s and 1940s in America, Nazism was rising in Germany. Hitler came to power in 1933. Jews, of course, were alarmed for good reason. American Jews, were not allowed to work as journalists in newspapers, but they were allowed to work as cartoonists. Because
Wait, wait. Did you say that a second time? Because I find that fascinating as a trained journalist. They
one
weren't
of the
allowed?
one of these forms of anti-Semitism in America was Jews were not allowed to work as journalists in major publications. They may have had their own little
Right,
newspapers,
right. And
but
there were Jewish. Okay. But
they were allowed to work as cartoonists, which was thought to be a lesser form of journalism. And so some of these American journalists, the first one, Joe Simon, whose real name was Jaime Simon, created Captain America. Um, Artist Jack Kirby,
wait,
whose
wait.
real name,
For those of us who can't remember very clearly what Captain America, you wanted two sentences about Captain America saves democracy, right?
right, Captain America was created 1941, in and around the time that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But he is a folkloric superhero figure dressed in all red, white, and blue who carries a shield with a star on it and an A for America on his helmet. And he was given a serum which made him into a super soldier, a powerful superhuman. And so I compare him to the golem. He's a creation meant to protect the people against bad and evil, just like the golem was created to protect the Jews of Prague against bad and evil. And
And
so
just to
he's,
clarify, he was fighting the Nazis. Is that right?
yes, so in all the magazines that came out in the 1940s, he primarily was fighting against the Nazis, including the Red Skull, which was one of the main antagonists, one of the bad guys that represented evil and the Nazis. So he's considered the leader of what are called the Avengers, which again is this American creation of a superhero group meant to protect the innocent.
Okay, now I interrupt you. Who was the next person you wanted to share?
So then Jack Kirby, and again, all these individuals were Jewish, so they had their real names. Jacob Kurtzberg also helped to create Captain America. Wonder Woman, and Wonder Woman, people probably know, is again a superhero, like thought to be almost a god-like, not God with a big G, but more like an
Mhm.
ancient Roman or Greek god. Female figure with superhero powers that protected the innocent. And that figure was created in 1941 also, but in Miriam Michelson's book, The Superwoman. Um, so again, interestingly enough, speed forward to just the last few years, Gal Gadot, an
Right.
Israeli Jewish actress, played
So wait,
Wonder.
wait. And did Wonder Woman, okay, everyone can see I don't know too much about this area. Did she also fight the Nazis
Yes,
in the
she also
40s?
fought the Nazis. Now she was an earlier creation, actually 1912, in this Miriam Michelson's book, but she was used in 1941 to fight against the Nazis and others.
So in an earlier one, she fought against other people, and then now
Right.
she, okay.
Other folkloric tales, the Hand of Miriam. We probably all know what the Hand of Miriam is. It's literally a hand in multicolors, usually gems. Others, it's a Jewish talisman, good luck charm. We have one hanging on our wall. It's meant to ward off bad and be a good luck charm. So it's called the Hand of Miriam. The Ark of the Covenant we talked about earlier. Again, the Jews have been searching, and the Nazis also in World War II were searching for the Ark of the Covenant, which is
I
why
saw Indiana Jones. That movie I saw.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. So that's that whole story. And again, one of these folkloric super weapons that everyone was searching for. Superman, another American creation, champion of the oppressed, again, created by American teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in the 1930s, in response to the rise of Nazism. Thought to be similar to Samson,
Hmm.
biblical tales. Jews and others believed in angels and miracles. I wrote in the book about prophetic dreams, Joseph in Genesis, and how my father had these dreams, which saved his life. I talked about the metal safety pin to ward off evil. Piece of thread. My father was a tailor. He was always chewing a piece of thread. I always thought it was just a nervous habit. In fact, it's an ancient Jewish belief that because the dead were wrapped in burial shrouds, that if they were sewing if they were chewing on a piece of thread, the thread couldn't be used to bury them in a burial shroud. So somehow that was warding off death. The sneeze, we probably all know, we say God bless you or
Right.
Gesundheit to ward off evil from rushing into the body. That's the
Oh, I
original
just thought it
belief.
was just being polite. I mean, I say it all the time. Just
Right, but
being
the
polite.
original purpose was to keep evil at bay. The first demon ever talked about was a Jewish creation, Lilith,
Yes.
who was before Eve. The golem, I've already talked about the golem. The blackbird. In many cultures, the blackbird, the crow, is thought to be a symbol of evil. And my father had a dream very quickly where he was in a concentration camp. He was sick. In his dream, he fought against a large black bird, defeated the black bird, threw it out of the bunker, the little building he was staying in. He woke up the next morning. He was very sick. Um, Others were sick because illness was spreading in the camp, but something told him no, he needed to get out under this forced march. He went on the forced march. Everyone who stayed behind was killed on the spot. And so he told a older Jewish man the story, and he said, "You dreamed about fighting evil and overcoming it." So another one of these miracles. So anyway, that's a very quick sort of going through some of these folkloric tales or beliefs.
And while these cartoonists were working, did did Americans in general understand what the cartoons were, or did they just think it was Disney-like entertainment?
I don't think they understood. They didn't know it was a Jewish American man creating a superhero figure to get the Americans to go to war against the Nazis. They just, I think, the Americans generally believed, oh, that's great. Now we have a super human figure to help us and to protect us. But no, do we have 10 seconds for me to read a quote from one of these
Oh,
cartoonists?
okay, we have a couple more minutes. Sure, go ahead.
So Jack Kirby, who was born Jacob Kurtzberg, who created Captain America, said, Jewish kids then were raised with a belief in moral values. In movies, good always triumphed over evil. Those are things learned from my parents and from the Bible, part of my Jewish heritage. Captain America was me, and I was Captain America. So,
So I understand that in America at that time, they could just think it was a general good against evil without really being able to see that it was a warning of what was actually happening.
right.
Yeah.
And it's true today, too. Captain
Yeah.
America, the movie, came out in 2011. And again, most people didn't think of it as being anything related to Jews. It was just an American superhero who helped fight interestingly against the Germans in this movie, but nothing related to Jews or anything else. So again, we in 2011 we were watching the movie and not realizing the connection.
I forget the character in the universe that was actually a survivor of the Holocaust, whichever universe I'm talking about, which I get confused, and how that's been kind of whitewashed. Do you know who I'm talking about? I'm confused.
Not offhand.
But some of these, even today, the actual purpose is whitewashed a little.
Right.
So that Americans just think this is great entertainment, isn't it?
Right. Right.
So actually, I would like to say we need to understand what's going on today. This is not a political show, so all I'm saying is, as we see history repeating itself in some ways, we need to be careful that these anti-Semitic tropes are not taking hold in our culture under different forms of anti-Semitism.
Right. And in the book, I spent quite a bit of time talking about, and I stayed away from modern political disputes, but I
Right.
talked about how the 1920s and the rise of Nazism foretold the 2020s and the rise of white nationalism and fascism. And so it's a warning. It's a warning to us to hopefully not let these things happen again.
That's what I wrote to the Wall Street Journal today, to the letter to the editor.
Right.
So all of us have to try to the best of our ability to make people understand that we need to safeguard our
Right.
democracy.
Right. Hatred of any kind obviously has been with us from the very beginning of
Right.
humans, and it's a constant struggle. To me, it's a constant struggle between good and bad, good and evil. But if we could learn, and this is a big ask, if we could learn from history and just try not to repeat the same things that we've done in the past, in this case, the 1920s, the rise of Nazism, and today, what's happening in the world, if we could learn these lessons, we obviously would be much better off for it. But unfortunately, so many people don't see the similarities and don't see the foreshadowing and don't know the history.
Right.
So
Which is what I'm trying to rectify in a very small scale, but I think it's so very important. So I thank you so much for sharing. Really, I think your topic is fascinating, and I will put the what's the name of the book again? I realized I actually in the introduction did the wrong book of your. So hold it up if you have it.
I do.
Hold it
Uh,
up.
this is the book. It's
Monsters and
Monsters and Miracles, Horror, Heroes, and the Holocaust. Amsterdam Publishers, 2022, and available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and elsewhere. And I've done a number of national and international podcasts for Kesher, for the American Museum of Jewish American Military History, for others on the book. And like I said, I'm setting up a tour, I should say, with Jerry Ulita Travel of Lithuania and Gil Travel.
Why don't you give me? I'll put two links in your thing. I'll put a link to your book on Amazon, and I'll put a link to the tour on your
Okay,
description because I think it's that important.
right. And I'll send you the link to the tour.
Excellent. Okay, I thank you so much, Ira, again. And but I have to end every one of these episodes by saying, "May the memories of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever."
God willing.